In this training, we will be covering management and disposition of property. We will talk about what this requires, if it applies to your project, and how to stay in compliance. When maintaining compliance with federal regulations around the management and disposition of property, it is helpful to understand how the federal government defines a capital asset. For the purpose of federal grants, capital assets include equipment or real property purchased or improved on under a federal grant program. Equipment is any item with a useful life of greater than 1 year and a per unit cost of $5,000 or more. Real property is land or buildings. Federally funded capital assets must be used for the intended purpose of the grant. For example, broadband last mile service. They must also be managed and disposed of in accordance with federal regulations. Equipment must reside with the subrecipient, be properly insured and maintained in working order. It must also be inventoried with property records that include, at a minimum, description of the property, serial or other ID number, source of funding and percentage of federal dollars used, identity of the title holder, acquisition date, cost of property, location, use, and condition of property, and, when relevant, disposition date. A physical inventory of the equipment must be taken every 2 years, and the equipment must be safeguarded from loss, damage, or theft. If something does happen to the asset, like loss, damage, or theft, it must be investigated and noted in files of record. Subrecipients may follow their existing commercial practices for managing equipment in the normal course of business and must use inventory controls indicating the applicable federal interest and loss prevention procedures. The federal government has a financial interest in all federally funded broadband projects. The U.S. Treasury and the NTIA have established a 10-year federal interest period for broadband infrastructure projects. BEAD-funded networks will be subject to a federal interest period that runs for 10 years after the network is constructed, completed, and closed out. For example, all subgrants closed out in 2027, regardless of the month. The federal interest period will last until December 31st, 2037. SLFRF and CPF networks are subject to a federal interest period that will end December 31st, 2034, if they are fixed amount awards. In the case of non-fixed amount awards, there is no standard limitation to the federal interest period, and the U.S. Treasury must be consulted prior to disposition of any federally funded property. Let's take a look at disposition. First, what is disposition? Disposition is the removal of a capital asset from service through the sale, disposal, or change of use. When federal funds are used for capital expenditures, federal regulation requires inventory, management, and disposition requirements for those expenditures. Grantees are required to comply with federal regulations when disposing of or changing the use of federally funded capital assets. Instructions for disposition may be listed in federal statute or awarding agency instructions. If not, instructions must be requested from the federal awarding agency. Generally, if an item has fair market value of less than $5,000, it can be disposed of or sold or retained with no further responsibility to the federal awarding agency. If the item has fair market value greater than $5,000, the federal awarding agency will be entitled to a portion of sale proceeds, or the title may be transferred to the federal government or an eligible third party for the duration of the federal interest period. Grantees must contact their OIT grant manager for more information regarding the disposition of equipment, as each grant program has specific guidelines. Does management and disposition of capital assets apply to my project? Yes, for the exception of the High Cost Support Mechanism grant program. So what do I have to do? Ensure federally funded assets are used for their intended purpose. Inventory all assets every 2 years and ensure all assets are properly maintained and insured. When assets are no longer needed, follow federal disposition requirements, and contact your OIT grant manager for any questions related to the management or disposition of federally funded assets. The U.S. Treasury and NTIA have clarified the capital asset requirements for federal broadband grants in writing.
And for BEAD, see the BEAD Guidance Policy Notice, tailoring the application of the uniform guidance to the BEAD program. Thank you for your time today and your commitment to learning more about the compliance requirements for the Advanced Colorado Broadband Grant Program. Please reach out to us with any questions at advance_CBO@state.co.us.